The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. My name is Mark Levine. I'm the Deputy Director of your New York State Association of Counties. Thank you all for joining NYSAC this morning for a webinar on internal controls, keeping county data and funds safe during COVID-19. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, we will hold questions until the end of the presentation, but if you have questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the questions panel or tab on the right side of your screen. We will take those questions one by one after the presentation is completed. Number two, under the handout tab, we have provided a risk assessment spreadsheet that our panelist Keeley and Hines will reference during the presentation. Number three, this webinar is being brought to you by CashVest by 3+1, a NYSAC partner and the sponsor of this morning's webinar. I would like at this time to turn the webinar introduction over to Garrett McDonald, Vice President of CashVest.
Good morning. My name's Garrett McDonald, and I'm with 3+1, and we're so pleased to have the opportunity to sponsor today's NYSAC webinar on internal controls, keeping county data and funds safe during the COVID-19 pandemic. 3+1 is helping counties boost credit rating for debt issuance and refinancing, provide data to forecast cash and debt needs, identify all cash as a revenue generating asset, reduce and monitor bank fees, and provide peace of mind in preparing and providing solutions during periods of financial stress. At this time, I'd like to introduce our panelist, Carol Cadregari, Executive Vice President of the Bonadio Group, and Keeley Ann Hines, Engagement Principal of the Bonadio Group. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am Keeley Hines and a principal with the Bonadio Group in our Government Compliance and Labor team. Before we get started, on behalf of all of employees at Bonadio, a big thank you to all of you elected and appointed officials. We know that this is a very challenging time for all of you, and we appreciate your efforts in keeping us healthy, providing our community with the necessary resources we need, and keeping us informed and educated. So thank you. We appreciate all that you do. So I'm going to get started on an overview of the internal controls, and then I will have Carl dive in specifically into the information technology piece of it. So in terms of internal controls, why are they so important? Well, first off, everybody wants to know that their assets are safe. So certainly the purpose for internal controls is to mitigate that fraud risk and protect, whether it be actual funds, whether it be inventory, equipment, supplies, things of that nature. Internal controls also comes into play with compliance. So for instance, a number of your counties have recently applied for FEMA funding in response to COVID-19. With that comes significant compliance requirements when receiving federal funding. One of the pieces that is required with that is to implement appropriate internal controls to mitigate risk for non-compliance. In addition to that, when a federal program is audited by your auditor, they will be looking to see that you have designed and properly implemented internal controls over those compliance requirements that are direct and material to you. Internal controls also comes into play to ensure accurate and reliable information. So in order for you folks to make appropriate decisions and determine where you are fiscally, you need to ensure that you have accurate and reliable information. If you are receiving figures and budget to actual reports that really require adjustment to reflect your actual position, then it makes it difficult for you to make those appropriate decisions. Internal controls is important for effective and efficient communication and information. So internal controls allows for you to have that efficient and effective communication streams between those charged with governance, management, all the way down to your support staff. And internal controls is really critical to ensure the continuation of your operations. So to continue to serve your citizens, you have to have a foundation for good internal controls so that your Department of Social Services can continue to provide the necessary benefits and services to your citizens. In the case where you need to be taking care of your roads, you again need to continue to ensure that those services can be provided. In terms of internal controls, this really pertains to everyone, top down, down up. Those charged with governance plays a critical role, your elected and appointed officials, your clerks, and your support staff. And I think that you'll see as we talk about these elements of internal control, it really does involve everybody that is involved in your county government in some capacity. So how can you ensure that you have established appropriate and adequate internal controls? In the 90s, early 90s, the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission developed a model for internal controls focusing in on 5 key components. More recently in 2013, that has been updated and there are now 17 key concepts that fall within those 5 components. Next slide, please. The first one is the control environment. So when I think about internal controls as a whole, I think about the control environment almost being the umbrella to the rest of the organization. Or another visual would be that it would be the base of a pyramid. It really speaks to the tone at the top and the governing body committing to appropriate levels of oversight and serving in an independent capacity from management. Things that usually come as a result of an appropriate control environment is organizational charts that specifically outline reporting lines and authority and responsibilities of key personnel all the way down into their specific departments. A lot of times employee handbooks, whistleblower policies, conflict of interest policies, all of these items are typically implemented and rolled out at the level with your governing board to ensure that you are setting the appropriate tone for sound internal controls within your county. An appropriate control environment sets us up for a level of accountability and ensuring that everybody knows that their actions will be held accountable, and certainly committing and continuing to commit to employment retention and staffing appropriately for those positions with the necessary skills, knowledge, and expertise needed. Next slide, please. The next component is risk assessment. The first step really is to develop a clear and concise plan. So this can come in many different forms, and I would think that it would vary dramatically depending upon the size and the nature of your particular county. And what that looks like is, again, determined by key personnel and those charged with governance, with the key point being that the idea is to identify, review, and analyze risks. So you could do that by implementing a task force or a committee of individuals that will come together And some of the items that should be considered in developing that plan should be the timing and frequency in which you meet and review your risk assessment. You can set objectives and goals for what you're looking to accomplish. And again, analyzing those risks that you're identifying and certainly giving special attention to a fraud risk would be critical. We'll actually speak to this a little bit further when I show you an example of a risk assessment spreadsheet that you can implement. Next slide, please. So the third component is control activities. So when I think about control activities, I suggest for you to think about those day-to-day activities and checks and balances that your county has put in place. So it could be a signature or a sign off, almost a check the box, so to speak. So the idea is to develop, document, and implement activities that will mitigate risk. Those really are what becomes your key controls, right? Because your key controls are going to be those that are critical to your operation to ensure that those risks are mitigated. They could be fraudulent risks. They could also be undetected risks of just simple error. And again, when developing and documenting these internal control processes, the idea is to ensure that yes, you develop these ideas, but that you document them and put them to paper and implement them, and also have documentation or some level of proof that those internal controls happened. I'm sure that all of you at one point or another have been asked by your auditor, show me, prove it to me, that sort of thing. So that documentation is so important to be able to demonstrate that the internal control happened and allow for you to ensure that that internal control happened. But also in this time that we are operating in with fewer staff and in this working from home environment, it's even more critical that those expectations and those procedures and internal controls are documented so that they can be shared and utilized by others, again, to allow for no disruption in your continued operations and what you can provide your communities. Carl will touch more on developing, documenting, and implementing control activities over technology. And then in the form of control activities, it's really making up those policies and procedures. So an example of what would represent those policies would maybe be your purchasing and your procurement policy. So your different thresholds of what you're going to do when you bid over X amount of dollars, or what triggers the need for an RFP, things of that nature. So those would be those adopted policies that happen globally at a control environment level. And then those procedures are those specific action plan items that allow the county to have confidence that those policies are being followed. So it could be as simple as something where X employee reviews, X employee signs and dates, and then does X. So it's really that execution piece of those policies and that expectation. Next slide, please. Information and communication. So this is critical for internal as well as external communications. So internal communications are within the organization in terms of making sure that you have the appropriate channels, resources, and tools to communicate. That really has become an issue at the forefront for everyone in terms of how can we continue to communicate even though we are not physically together in the same place. And again, technology comes into play with some of that, and we'll get into that a little bit more. And then other internal communication items that should be considered is certainly ensuring that your staff and members of the county have the ability to report or communicate with somebody if there is ever a fraud concern. I know that our firm has offered fraud tip lines or fraud hotlines before to various counties. Some of our counties that have an elected comptroller or have a sophisticated internal audit department, there might be something arranged through that. But again, it's giving your employees the opportunity to be able to communicate any of those types of concerns. And then in terms of external communications, you need to consider firewalls. Do you have appropriate portals, share files, ways that then you can communicate with outsiders, even if it means that you are working from home and you have folks working remotely. And again, Carl will touch on that a little bit more. Monitoring activities. So this is the big piece where you kind of step back and say, is what we're saying we're doing actually happening, and is this working? So are the internal controls that we've put in place operating effectively? So there's a number of ways that you can do that. Often folks have claims auditors that are in place to help ensure that A, B, and C has happened before a check is cut. Folks sometimes have internal auditors. And sometimes you may have to make do and get creative with what you have for some of those smaller counties that may not necessarily have a full department for internal audit. But certainly there are ways to determine whether those internal controls are happening effectively, whether it be that you sample out of a 30-day, 60-day window to ensure that things are operating effectively. One place that I want to point out that would not be an adequate monitoring activity is your external audit. I think a lot of times folks think, oh, well, that's okay, I don't have to check that, or we don't have to consider that because our external auditors will test that. Certainly, at times, our scope may be significantly less than yours for various reasons, depending upon what it is that we're talking about. And furthermore, your external auditor cannot serve as part of your internal control process. As your independent external auditor, we cannot be part of management and part of overseeing your internal controls. So unfortunately, relying on the fact that you have an independent external audit would not be enough to demonstrate that you have appropriate monitoring activities. And then to take that a step further, upon that monitoring, you have to have a method for evaluating and communicating those deficiencies and really identifying the who, what, where, when, and why. So why did that happen, and what sort of corrective action can take place? And you, as you can probably see, this sort of intertwines with that risk assessment. Part of performing that risk assessment is really you monitoring what's going on. And again, we'll talk about that risk assessment and the different steps that you should consider when developing one, but really that monitoring piece of the risk assessment is critical, or else it really serves no value. This is a practical example that I like to share just because I think it brings to light this concept of these 4 components of internal control in a very real life way in terms of operating a vehicle. It's something that we do all the time. At this time, probably a lot less than we have in the past, as we all, continue to work remotely and in that type of environment. But the concept here is really that the control environment, the control activities, information and communication, your risk assessment and your monitoring, all of that happens everywhere. So in the case of operating a motor vehicle, that control environment or that governance that takes place is really through the New York State DMV, through the court system. The control activities are everything from police involvement, license testing. So not anybody can just get a driver's license, right? Like there's controls in place to ensure that a 10-year-old can't hop behind the wheel without meeting certain criteria, age requirements, passing a test, things of that nature. Information and communication, there's signage indicating to you what you should be doing to follow the rules. in the laws, whether it be to stop or to not exceed 45 miles per hour. And then there's further communication specifically in our laws and regulations, and then even in written tickets when you've been caught doing something that you're not supposed to. In terms of identifying risks, there's checkpoints, cameras at streetlights where they have maybe identified folks are running through red lights. There's speed traps. Any of you folks in the southern tier are, I'm sure, are familiar with that spot right before Binghamton, heading down 81 South. That's a favorite spot for folks to set up and check for speeding. So again, they're responding to risks in a particular area where they've identified problems in the past. And then continuing monitoring through point systems. If, you know, in the event that you exceed the threshold of the number of points, then you would have your license temporarily revoked. There's license renewals and obviously probationary periods for our early licensed drivers. So again, it's just kind of a real life practical example as to where these 5 components really come into play in all aspects of our lives. Okay, so in terms of our action plan, so if you take a look at the copy of the risk assessment spreadsheet that has been provided in the panel link that was referenced at the beginning of the webinar, you will see that there's a copy of an example of a risk assessment document. Again, this is a very simple preliminary baseline for you to come up with a risk assessment for your county. You can identify your types of risks. I think it's important to really solicit folks in terms of what are they seeing and saying that they think there are risks here. Providing a full description of the risk, identifying the departments, and then really zeroing in on the significance of the risk. I've seen folks have great success with scoring those risks because if nothing else, it allows for you to properly respond and develop a corrective action plan and deal with those items that are most significant or critical first. So certainly if you have a significant fraud risk, that needs to be addressed typically immediately. And this scoring system on a 1 to 10 would allow for you to say, okay, maybe for the moment, we can tolerate a certain risk. We know we need to take action, but it can be a future action item. And then maybe a certain range would indicate this needs immediate action and we need to deal with this now. And then another key element to that is really what is your corrective action plan? And then what is your method for monitoring that? So how are you going to test that and ensure that whatever corrective action plan you've put in place has truly mitigated or eliminated that risk? And then truly identifying what your triggering event for resolution is critical. I think it's important in the beginning to identify what you think needs to happen to say that that item is truly resolved. And then certainly identifying a responsible party. This not only allows for accountability and ensuring that this happened, but it also allows for even your governance, whether it be your board of supervisors, county legislators, for them to truly understand, okay, this is the person that's responsible for this, and they can address specific questions too for that person, and that that person is specifically responsible for this action item. And then consideration should be given to corrective action plans to be approved by somebody, so the who and the when. And it may mean that all of your corrective actions are approved by one particular person, but that may not always be appropriate. If you have some risks that are specific to DSS, it certainly wouldn't make sense that somebody from the transportation department be approving that corrective action. So again, identifying the appropriate person to make that approval. Oh, I'm sorry, can you skip back for a quick second? Thank you. So in addition to that risk assessment, you want to continue to evaluate your segregation of duties. So authorization, custody, and recording. So to bring this to life in a very simple way, if I am an authorized signer on checks, and I also hold the checkbook, and I'm also responsible for recording the transaction in the general ledger, I have all of the opportunity in the world to do something that I am not supposed to do. So we always say that that triangle, authorization, custody, and recording, we don't want to be able to form that triangle with somebody standing in the middle of it with the ability to do all three of those. And this is really critical to keep in mind because let's face it, our headcounts have had to be reduced in some places. So through furlough and lower headcount, we are then increasing our risk for these roles to bleed into one another. So really stepping back and reflecting, again, as part of that risk assessment, are there individuals with the capability of doing all three of these? And if there is, what can we do to eliminate that? And then further action items are checking in with your IT department. So, you know, everybody wants this pandemic and the responses that we've had to put in place to be over. However, it's just not the reality. And there's speculation that we can find ourselves, you know, back in this position again. So I think it's important to really check in with IT to figure out, do we receive like IT tickets or troubleshoot emails, whatever your method is for those issues to be communicated? And are we seeing a trend? Do we have issues with connectivity or, you know, interruptions that are taking place in that connectivity? And is the equipment working adequately? Are we able to continue to execute our job responsibilities without significant interruption? And then certainly considering just the volume of equipment, and if your county is really needing more to ensure folks can adequately work safely and remotely when needed. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think a lot of you folks are probably experiencing replacing pen and paper with electronic files and email approvals. This is all okay. The piece that you have to keep in mind, though, is that you still want to have that documentation, and you need to be able to have a method for retaining it. So in the event that you are using emails for approvals triggering any sort of event, you should have a method in place to ensure that those emails can be identified and found later. So implementing some sort of method for retention is really critical, because again, we're losing some of what we maybe were previously accustomed to with pen and paper and files and things of that nature. A lot of folks are utilizing the electronic signatures more. Here at Bonadio, we use electronic signatures for our partner principal group for signing our engagement letters. However, we're pretty strict with that, and we keep them secure. Typically, the individual whose signature it is has a copy of it, and their specific administrative support staff. And that's about it. It doesn't go much further than that. And the reason for that is, again, to mitigate the risk that that signature could be used by somebody else in an inappropriate manner. E-signature stamps, like if you have a physical stamp with somebody's signature and you've determined that that's a way that you can continue to utilize or continue to adhere to social distancing, but still utilizing their signature, that's fine. But again, consideration needs to be given to where is that stored, who has access to it, and is there still being permission being granted before that signature is used. And again, proof for that. So it may be in the form of an email saying, yes, go ahead and sign A, B, C, and D, and then retaining that evidence, and then that one person that maybe is in the office can then go and stamp the necessary signatures. Certainly this is a time that we are being forced to reassign responsibilities as necessary, and considering balance and workload. There might be an individual that needs to focus on FEMA funding tracking, and so maybe some of their other responsibilities need to be reassigned. Again, making sure that you're considering any sort of risk in making those changes is really critical, because you don't want to fix one thing to then subsequently result in a risk elsewhere. And really talking to your team about the challenges that they're experiencing and what have they had to change. I think really just asking them, hey, what is your day looking like now versus how it looked 90 days ago? What are you doing differently? In having that conversation, you may very well come up with a risk that you were unaware of, because somebody may have inadvertently made a decision to do something different because they couldn't think of another way to do that, and knowing that they still needed to complete their job assignments, they altered something, but maybe it's now resulting in a risk that needs to be addressed and mitigated. And then what sort of new responsibilities exist for these folks, and are they able to manage that? And again, hopefully no risks are resulting. I think, during this time, not only is constant communication with your team and your departments critical for these very reasons, but it's also just important to ensure that we're remaining connected and keeping that team-based atmosphere and continuing that level of trust and working together. Again, I think that will ensure that your county continues to succeed and continue to serve the community. Next slide. So evaluating for the future. So right now, I think it's important that you all consider what the coming months look like and maybe what can be done to make improvements, or perhaps be ready for another wave of having the instance where we ramp back up, but we may have to come back down and reduce headcount again. So really identifying and training on new tools that can be useful for your teams. Maybe it means, portable scanners, using scan apps on phones, WebExes. I know some folks are using Teams through Microsoft that can allow for them to file share and continue to communicate. And then again, continuing to consider that cross-training. My husband is a CPA as well and works in private, and as a result of having to reduce headcount and traffic in the building, they found that as trivial as it was, there was not anybody in the building that knew how to run the machine to actually print the bills out of their system. So as a mundane task as it may have been, they really were left saying, oh my gosh, we don't know how to do this. We really need to start considering cross-training and ensuring that other individuals know how to do things and not just one person. And then continuing to evaluate your IT capacity. I know within the first couple of days that Bonadio went remote, our poor VPN was, on complete and utter overload. And our wonderful IT folks addressed that quickly, but the first 24 hours, it basically was responding saying, we've never had 600 and 700 people on this all at the same time. And it certainly was causing some small issues, but again, making sure that you are prepped and ready for that IT capacity to have folks logging in and working remotely. And then continuing to identify what your essential positions are versus who are key candidates to work remotely. So who do you need to have physically in the building, and here are the reasons why, and here are the folks that, yeah, we think they can continue to operate, execute their job duties, and do so safely and remotely. And then certainly having a what if and contingency plan documented. it certainly will allow for a smoother process of going into this remote work from home environment. And quite honestly, I mean, this is not really a situation that can happen just because of a pandemic like we were hit with COVID-19, but this can happen with natural disasters. I mean, some of you folks have had experience with that in recent years with things like flooding, and where you may have had a period of time where you couldn't get into your buildings and work on site. So really having that plan in place holds everybody accountable. It keeps the expectations clear, and again, ensures that continuing flow of service. And then really consider your accounting software and seeking support where you think is necessary. We have found, through the years that a number of our clients are using some really great sophisticated accounting software, and certain modules or certain features aren't being utilized, and management is defaulting back to paper copies and hard copy files and pen to paper sign-offs and things of that nature. Those are the places where folks are struggling to say, okay, how do we get around this? How do we get these approvals? And a lot of times, some of your softwares may have some of those capabilities built in, and you just may not know. A good example is approving purchase orders or purchase requisitions. You can have a feature for somebody setting that up and a feature for somebody approving that, and basically having it work through individuals' queues and popping up when they are ready for that next level of review. And then here's a copy of the attachment that Jeanette had included in that handouts tab. And I will turn over the next slide to Carl so he can dive into IT.
Thank you, Keeley, and thank you for all the attendees. And I would like to echo Keeley's thoughts, and thanks for everything, the information that you've shared with us during a very, very difficult time. The risks from a work from home environment from the information technology standpoint tend to be ones that we've experienced in the past, but in the past, though, it hasn't been at the volume or level that we have been experiencing through this pandemic. One of the things that I wanted to do is walk through each one of these key areas that changed, what's the same, what to plan for, what to do now, and things to think about regarding your post-reentry processes. These are some key items, and obviously not all of them. I'm going to buzz through a couple of the items very quickly, and a few of them I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, but there should be some key focus on making sure that the data that you're collecting is correct, making sure that the cybersecurity controls you have in place are still operating effectively, and making sure that it's well communicated what the expectations are for all of your personnel when they re-enter the workforce and start coming back to the office. So next slide, please. Okay, so what's changed? Work from home environment. It significantly adds complexity to the overall environment and the IT structure. When you think about working from home, you're extending the information technology environment to multiple locations, sometimes with very little control on your side. Not saying that the people who are working from home aren't performing the duties and the access and the job functions that they're supposed to, but you don't have the ability to control their entire environment. What else is in the environment? What else is happening while they're there? What information is being shared unintentionally that may need to be communicated? And what are they doing with the remote equipment that you're going to need to confirm once that equipment comes back into your workforce? Yeah. The access and information regarding VPN, Keeley was very, very on point. Our poor VPN, like she said, suffered for a couple of days. We haven't had to stress that level of connections and have that many connections. But this is an area where, like Keeley mentioned, if an organization's users are stressed and cannot connect, they may be doing alternative methods to make sure that they get their job done. And some of those alternative methods are ones you're going to have to be comfortable with assessing as part of your risk assessment when the information and the technology comes back into the organization. Okay. The other bullet in there talks about the traditional support process. How is IT handling, the addition of multiple locations, multiple areas, multiple logins, multiple, touch points, where before a support person could walk to a desk and help someone. Now it's all remote. It's all adding complexity. It's all adding, connections and communications that are slightly new and slightly challenging. Okay. Next slide, please. One of the big challenges that everybody is going through is it significantly is adding to the data backup process. When you think about the traditional organizational computer that's connected to your local network environment at your office, it's fairly easy to back up that system. Right? There's a persistent connection. There's a wire between the data backup server and the desktop. That's gone away with the remote connection, unless the person is connected via VPN. If they're storing any potential information on their device that hasn't been synced back to the backup server, there's the potential that the backup process is being interrupted and you may not be capturing all the information you need to conduct your business on an ongoing basis. There is a significant potential for a larger cyber breach surface. All you have to do is Google work from home cyber breaches, and there's dozens and dozens of stories already out there where organizations have been affected. From the ransomware attacks that everybody's heard about, all the way down to malicious activities where transactions are being captured, financial transactions are being captured in the middle of the wire or in the middle of the process of communicating to banks. There's a large issue of cyber breach concerns there that is just been extended. I mean, you're extending your firewall, you're extending your network to multiple entry points for those threat actors to attack you on. It also increases that whole hygiene process with computers. How are you handling your antivirus updates? How are you handling your anti-malware updates? Are systems and software applications being correctly updated? Are the patches to insecure, vulnerabilities or other issues happening with those devices? And a lot of times it increases the hygiene concerns if the device may not be a county distributed device. If it's a personal device that you're allowing access, how are you controlling that? What are you doing on that side? Data privacy is definitely another significant concern. I mean, literally, if someone's working from their table and they're discussing a human resources issue with another member of the team, is anybody overhearing that? Is there concerns for that data being shared outside of the remote location, the home location? So making sure the team understands what's appropriate communications while they're working from home is one of the new normals. Okay. And then the regulatory and data protection management surface has increased. Okay. When you think about you performing your regulatory risk assessment, now you have to extend it all the way to all of those remote locations. So that's another potential change from what we used to be worried about. Next slide, please. What the challenge is, though, even with all those other additional changes, everything else is still the same. Okay? You still have to worry about asset management. You still have to worry about compliance with your policies and procedures. Your vendor management program still has to be taken care of. And as I mentioned before, the data backup, how are you handling program management and communications via electronics? Keeley mentioned that e-signature process that a lot of organizations are going through. Have you confirmed that it meets the state and federal regulations for electronic signatures as part of the processes that you're going through? These are all areas of additional scrutiny, but the things that you still have to do on a day-to-day basis. Next slide, please. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on what to plan for now and what to plan for the reentry process. So planning for now, there has been a lot of relaxing of some of the standards and some of the expectations for communication of protected information. HIPAA specifically, they have published, the Office of Civil Rights and Health and Human Services has published several articles regarding allowing communications to be a little less rigorous than they have been in the past. General Business Law 899 AA, which is a new rule for New York State that all entities with New York State resident data have to comply with. There's been a little bit of relaxing and some communications on that as well, even though there are some expectations for the compliance requirements. And then also in the OSC, the processes that they're looking at in the past during the audit program, there's been some communications where they're giving a little less rigor currently than they were in the past. But what the changes are that you have to be concerned with is, because these are material changes to your infrastructure environment, all of the rules and regulations that are associated with cybersecurity and laws and regs specifically talk about any material change in the organization as a trigger for a risk assessment. It would be expected that that's something that you need to plan for now when you're doing that risk assessment, to make sure that you include this pandemic outcome as part of the risk communications and risk testing that you do. Okay. There's the reentry from home expectations. Okay. Who's still going to be allowed to work from home on a regular basis versus the people who you want to have in the office on an ongoing basis once the pandemic issues are lightened up. Okay. Also, what your new normal will be with that combination is something to make sure that you plan for and communicate to your team. Probably one of the biggest challenges. Next slide. All right, so what to do now before you move anything else forward? Okay, make sure your users have given you a copy of the inventory that they have and that they are using. Make sure that you understand both the equipment and information that was supplied via the county, and also any BYOD, anything that's bring your own device that's part of it. Have an opportunity and to have IT access all the work from home computers and make sure that antivirus is up to date, anti-malware, and the patches are done. That's a real critical area. Also, at the same time that they're doing that, have them assess any desktop stored data that isn't been backed up within the standard environment processes, making sure that that's tackled. And then to help with the cyber hygiene areas is making sure that you have an opportunity to track VPN usage for any particular unusual activity. I mean, it's normal for you to have 700 connections or 300 or 200 connections from an 8 to 5 aspect, but are they persistent past 5 o'clock? Are they coming up over the weekends? Are there things that you need to investigate? Next slide, please. Definitely get in touch with any of your cloud vendors, any of those support organizations where you're using external software or people are accessing external software, and make sure that they communicate back to you the active user accounts that are in place. Okay? Plan for the compliance activities of those regulations, including the General Business Law 899, both AA and BB. Get that started. There's a policy procedure suite, there's risk assessments, there's a vendor management component to that is very significant. This is also a perfect time to start testing your incident response plan, making sure that if you do have a cyber incident, that you can react to it appropriately and quickly and not cause you any additional delays in managing a breach or a potential breach. And then plan for the asset return and make sure people understand what the expectation is going to be when they come back into the office. Are they required to bring those assets back? Are they required to have them at home? Making sure that everybody has a clear understanding of what's expected for them. Next slide, please. When the equipment comes back, compare it to the list that you thought that you had. Okay? Make sure that you track it. There's going to be opportunities to redeploy it. There's going to be opportunities to upgrade internal. Tracking the assets are going to be a good financial factor for you to make sure that you have control over those redeployments and what you're doing. Okay? Get the risk assessment done. Make sure it's documented and that you include this whole pandemic area like I mentioned before. There is a risk assessment process that's specific to information technology that's provided by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, so NIST. I will send a copy of that to Jeanette so she can distribute it to everybody who's on the webinar. It is a public piece of information, but it is a good process to follow. get the vulnerability scanning done on every incoming computer before it's connected to the network. So you're not exposing your network to any unknown or unpatched environment. And along with vulnerability scanning, make sure the antivirus and anti-malware scans are run in depth on all computers. Make sure there's no latent software or malware that's sitting on it that could potentially cause you harm. Next slide, please. Recertify the users at the cloud. Okay. Back up all those data from those work-at-home computers that are being brought into you. Save them, and then compare them to your backup to make sure that there hasn't been anything that was missed. Get the policy procedure suite updated for the controls that are changed because of the work-from-home environment. You know, remote access, usage of a technology, VPN access, you know, anything like that, including BYOD, you bring your own device access. Okay. And then document any areas of concern for management's review to make sure it's part of not only the risk assessment, but part of any type of risk mitigation plan moving forward. Next slide. I read through those fairly quickly. Those, like I said, are some key areas and key items. At this point, we would be more than glad, Keeley and I would be more than glad to take any questions.
I would ask the participants in the webinar, if you have any questions, to please type those questions in to the questions panel on the right side of your screen. One question here. So some county officials were sent home to work from home at the beginning of the pandemic, and then they may have been laid off or furloughed. How do you recommend the county handling that situation in terms of assets? Or
so
anything else?
What we were seeing. Yeah, this is Carl. Keeley, if you have any advice on top of what I'm going to share, I'm more than glad to, give you whatever we need to do to share the information. What we're seeing, though, in many instances when there's a furlough, we've had organizations supply a request for the information, a request for the assets returned. We've had some organizations send them prepaid, UPS stickers to get things back. We've had some organizations make it mandatory that their final severance or anything else having to do with the furlough won't be supplied until the equipment's returned. So it's really up to the county and what their normal process is for terminating and furloughed employees. But again, making sure that that information is collected is also very important. Terminating their access while they're furloughed, shutting off their VPN, shutting off their network access, and then confirming with any cloud vendors that they don't have access would be the other steps.
Okay, thank you. Another question, are the slides available? Yes, the slides are available on our website right now, and a recording of this webinar will be available probably tomorrow morning or early afternoon. Is there a CPE available for this webinar? Jeanette is checking with the State Comptroller's Office, and that decision will be forthcoming. We will let you know in the event that there is a CPE credit available here. Another question for Bonadio: how do you address the state-county relationship? Sometimes there are often for counties and several county departments like DMV and Social Services and Department of Health, there's a connection between the county and the state agency that they are working with. How do you deal with that in terms of controls?
Yeah, you want to? Yeah, let's do the financial or your side, and then I'll talk about IT.
Yeah, that is definitely a challenge that some of our clients face, like with the example of the DMV, and obviously there's only so much you can do if it's not your county information versus the state information. However, I think that in terms of ensuring that assets and access to equipment in county-owned items is still restricted when it's on your premises. So I'm thinking about like a DMV, and that the equipment and computer equipment and things like that are still being protected and safe, even if the DMV is really, you know, a New York State department. And then certainly in terms of like the exchange of information, and maybe Carl can kind of speak to this a little bit more, but I think again, ensuring that that exchange is happening on a safe network, and that any of that information that then the county needs to receive, that it's being properly backed up and retained.
Yeah, Keeley, that's a good point. I think one of the biggest challenges that the counties see is where does their point of responsibility end in supporting the network, supporting the connections, all of those things. This goes along with that whole process of least rights. So what should the state employee, the state assets have access to or be able to utilize within the county network? Any logical segregation, so the technological segregation that the county can do that doesn't interrupt the state's ability to process the information that they need to process while on county premises or using county networks is absolutely acceptable and expected in many ways. There's a lot of technological geekdom that we can get into regarding those settings and those network controls. But the reality is you can set them up so there's enough of a buffer, enough of a firewall, for the lack of a better term, between the two networks so that you are protected if the county were to have some additional, if the state were to have an additional issue, a malware attack, a ransomware attack, or something else like that. That gets into a little bit of the technological controls that are a little too geeky potentially, but I'd be more than glad to talk about any of those at any point offline if someone wants to send me a note or a question.
Okay, yes. So could you provide the contact information, maybe your email, Keeley and Carl, for the audience, and so that they might be able to follow up with you directly if they have any questions.
Yeah, if we put it in that, can everybody see it?
Jeanette, do you have a list of?
Keeley, we can type this right into the program, and I can also include it in the slide when I post the slide deck on the on our website, so I can add that post webinar as well.
Perfect.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay, great. Without any further questions, I want to thank you both, Keeley and Carl, for taking the time this morning to lend your expertise and your experience with the members of the New York State Association of Counties. We appreciate you. We appreciate the Bonadio Group for putting on and helping us with this webinar this morning. We also want to thank CatchVest by 3+1 for sponsoring this event. Thank you all very much for attending, and we appreciate your time. We appreciate your attention. Have a great day.